Josh Klipp. I am the founder and principal of Made Welcome, which is a consulting firm focused on accessibility at workplaces and events. I am a recovering attorney. I like to say I spent over 16 years in the public sector working for various government agencies specializing in the ADA. I left litigation to start my own consulting practice, which is Made Welcome, and I also am a certified access specialist through California's Division of the State Architect. My current clients range from state and local governments covered by ADA Title II, as well as large retailers such as Starbucks, covered by the ADA's Title III. And I also teach a certification course on event accessibility. The first step is really having the right policies in place. So, for instance, what are your policies around providing effective communication for people who are deaf or hard of hearing? And what are your policies for providing translation services for people who may have limited English proficiency? Your policy is the backbone to ensuring effective communications. The second step is training. Make sure that staff who may interact with customers and employees who may be deaf or hard of hearing or who may have limited English proficiency, make sure that these staff are aware of these policies and what is expected of them as they interact with or serve these customers or employees. The third step is to make sure that your policies are available to the public and that people are informed on how to ask for what they need. So, for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, for example, you want to make sure that they know that they can ask for effective communications, as well as how to go about doing that. For people who have limited English proficiency, the same principle applies. It needs to be abundantly clear that they have the right to request translation services and how they would go about doing this. In this instance, you'd need to ensure that the policy and processes are available in multiple languages. Drilling down just a bit on publicizing in multiple languages, the Department of Justice has guidance on how to perform a four-step analysis on what are the predominant non-English languages most frequently used based on census data in your area. So if you're wondering which languages you should include in your public-facing policies, the US Census data is a great place to start. And finally, you need to have the competencies in place to ensure effective communications can be provided. For people who are deaf or hard of hearing, this can mean captioning and ASL. Personally, I recommend always having captions. For ASL, I recommend having a vendor on hand who can be engaged and ready to go with short notice. For people with limited English proficiency, it helps to identify who on your staff speaks other languages and make sure that there's a list somewhere of those people. This way, if someone calls or comes up to a service desk who needs translation services, you can quickly check if someone is available to help. Alternatively, there are also some great digital translation services out there. I've personally used some of these while working on policies for ADA Title II clients for information that required basic translation. So basically, Section 508 of the Rehab Act requires that federal agencies make their information and communications technology, or ICT, accessible to people with disabilities. ICT includes websites, software, and any other technologies used by federal employees and the public. So the goal of Section 508 is to provide comparable access and usability to individuals with disabilities as those without disabilities. So to summarize, Section 508 applies to websites, digital platforms, training materials, basically all ICT when those are used by federal agencies. Conversely, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. This means that organizations receiving federal funds cannot exclude individuals from participation or deny them benefits or otherwise discriminate against them on those grounds of race, color, or national origin. So while Section 508 has to do with providing accessible ICT, Title VI addresses equal access based on race, color, or national origin. And it's in Title VI where providing translation services comes into play. As for how WCAG interacts with digital assets and language translation, there are basically two principles that I'm aware of. So remembering that WCAG, we've got 508 applies to federal agencies, Title VI applies to any organization that receives federal funding. And WCAG, per the new rule by the DOJ, applies to Title II entities. So that's state and local governments. State and local governments is different from federal agencies. WCAG is now applying to state and local governments, whereas 508 applies to federal agencies. So as for how WCAG interacts with digital assets and language translation, so remembering that WCAG is to make digital assets accessible, and it's got those 50 success criteria. So there are basically two principles relative to language translation services within WCAG that I'm aware of. So first, WCAG requires that a screen reader be able to identify the language of the digital asset. So we're coming together here of digital accessibility for people with disabilities and translation services under WCAG. There's a lot going on here. First, so WCAG requires that a screen reader be able to identify the language of the digital asset. So if a website is written in Swahili, for instance, WCAG requires that the website be coded so that a screen reader can identify that this website is written in Swahili. Second, WCAG itself is built on four principles. Right? The first is that digital content is perceivable. That's the first. Second, that it's operable. Third, that it's understandable. And four, that it's robust. And it's that third principle, understandable, that would apply to translation services in the context of digital access. Specifically, you want to use language on your website that can be understood. Specifically, you want to use language that can be understood not just in the language of the website, for example, English, but that can easily be understood once the language is translated, for example, from English to Spanish. So the principle of WCAG, of using understandable language, also helps when you are then translating that website. So this is where we're starting to get into the interactions between WCAG and Title VI. This is a great question. Translation technology is still relatively new. It's largely driven by artificial intelligence or AI, and AI is a learning technology. So that means it gets more and more accurate over time. But when it comes to cultural nuance, AI still has some learning to do. So my advice would be that when you're communicating a message across global offices and want to respect cultural nuance, ideally you'd have someone who is a native speaker that can review the message to ensure it's respectful of that culture. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, covers employees with 15 or more employees, and that includes state and local governments. In California, where I'm located, that threshold is even lower. Specifically, for employers with 5 or more employees, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA, mandates providing reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. So the number of employees makes a difference depending on where the employer is located. When it comes to accommodating employees with disabilities, there's currently no affirmative requirement to ensure that a workplace is accessible. It's on a case-by-case basis, depending on the employee's disability, their role, and whether they can perform the essential functions of their role with or without an accommodation. And the accommodation cannot constitute what the law deems an undue burden, which is a fairly high threshold. There's a lot more to it, but that's the basic idea. In terms of what the law requires for the customers of a corporation, that's primarily covered under the ADA's Title III. Specifically, places of public accommodation need to be accessible to people with disabilities. Because the ADA was signed into law back in 1991, it didn't and couldn't contemplate things like shopping online, using an app for commercial goods and services, etc. And the earlier lawsuits challenging the accessibility of digital services generally yielded some pretty mixed results based on some very specific fact patterns. That said, WCAG as a standard is becoming more and more ubiquitous and generally accepted as a way to ensure that your digital services are accessible to people with disabilities. WCAG is created by a consortium of experts and people with disabilities, so it's not just a random set of standards. It's incredibly thorough, thoughtful, and based on real life needs. So more and more companies are starting to adopt this into their digital product development and testing procedures. Ultimately, while this isn't required by law, it's smart business because number one, your product has a competitive edge. Number two, it's a statement of your company values. And number three, yes, it will help to defend, mitigate, or even altogether avoid disability discrimination lawsuits. Accessibility consultant and not as strong on the security and privacy requirements, but essentially you want to make sure that security and privacy are prioritized and that any cybersecurity requirements are in place. My understanding is that this is largely outlined in SOC 2 or System and Organization Controls 2, which is a framework developed to assess and report on the controls relevant to security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy of a service organization systems. So SOC 2 is a widely recognized standard, particularly for service providers handling sensitive customer data. This is a question that kind of answers itself. Companies with global and diverse workforces work better and more efficiently when communication barriers are reduced or altogether eliminated. And this is something that AI generated translation services are really well suited to address in the day to day of doing business. I'll give you a real world example. My wife, who speaks English, works for a global consulting firm. One of her clients was based in Japan, and the team there spoke Japanese. And I recall watching her do video meetings with a translator, and I was struck by not only how long it took, but also by how it required a major adjustment in terms of how meetings typically flow, for lack of a better term. Now, let's say that the meeting had featured AI generated language translation. You could still have had the translator to check for accuracy and cultural nuance, but the team in the project probably could have moved much more efficiently. And if it can do that for client and customer communications, it can also do that for internal communications between employees who speak multiple languages. There are so many reasons why this should happen, but the main reason is that you want to offer as many ways to participate and engage as possible. So during COVID, for example, a lot of people started using captions on meetings and webinars because they were at home and didn't always have control over what was happening around them. For instance, I live in a building with 4 condos and shared walls. And when my neighbor was working out in her living room and creating a fair amount of ambient noise, I would turn on captions so that I didn't miss anything. The same idea applies to the office, especially offices that have open floor plans and shared spaces. Having captions available gives employees multiple ways to access the content. Finally, and I think most importantly, when captions are available as a matter of course, you take the burden off employees who may be deaf or hard of hearing from having to ask for them. The World Health Organization estimates that around 20% of the population has some sort of hearing loss. When you provide captions, this means that 20% of people don't feel like they have to disclose what might feel hard or embarrassing for them. Now, captions may ultimately not be enough or may not be exactly what they need, but at least they're there. It's an option and it's a statement of company values. Plus, most captioning companies provide an option for transcripts. This could be a value add for employees who are deaf or hard of hearing who want to go back and reread those so that they can fully comprehend and absorb the content. For years, AI generated captions have been notoriously bad and inaccurate to the point where captions have often been horribly wrong and sometimes wildly embarrassing. That said, AI has made leaps and bounds in just the last few years, and AI generated captioning has also improved in some instances to the point where it's even more accurate than a human captioner. But it's a mistake to assume that this means it's enough for anyone who is deaf or hard of hearing. People communicate and take in information in a diversity of ways. Some people communicate primarily through sign language, and there's a big difference between sign language and captions. Sign language can capture nuance and emotion and nonverbal communications in a way that captions simply cannot. Also, if a person who is deaf or hard of hearing requests a human captioner, you should engage and find out more about that. Again, Accuracy rates mean a lot. Someone recently told me that for every 1% inaccuracy in captions, they experience a 10% loss in efficacy. So if an AI generated captions is only 90% accurate, that translates to a 100% inability to engage. Now, I don't know where this number comes from, but it at least reflects one person's experience. So if you offer AI generated captions as a matter of course, but someone still asks for human captioning, which is also known as CART, it doesn't hurt to ask why. And if it's related to issues like real time syncing and accuracy, do some research and find out how your AI generated captioning compares.